No, I'm good. Thanks, Jake. I like the egg. Though I think you missed the chance to call yourself an expert. I think that was a pun missing. So I'm the last speaker, I think, of over 3 long days. So I thought, how can I make sure that people are still awake and paying attention? And I'm an economist, so I run by incentives. I've got a nice block of Swiss chocolate here for some lucky audience member in the next 15 minutes. Hopefully not too soon, otherwise you may taper off. So I was asked to present, and I quote, the state of the art in human and social capital measurement and modeling. That seemed like an ambitious ask, and I immediately thought of this man. So first chance of the chocolate, can anyone tell me who this is? Ah, that was easy. Okay, now you have to pay attention for the next 15 minutes. So I know Julian, I saw Julian had his hand up in the back. I'll explain. So this is Isaac Asimov. He's a famous author. He wrote one of my favorite books of all time, this book called Foundation. He's a science, well, he's written many things, but this is a science fiction novel. So the idea in this novel is that we are 13,000 years in the future. And there's a galactic empire spanning many thousands, tens of thousands of planets. And that empire is run from one planet called Trantor. And on that planet, there's a group of scientists, and they have developed a new field of science called psychohistory. I don't know how the translator is going to manage with that word, but anyway, it's a new branch of social science in which the founder, a man called Harry Seldon, is able to predict human and social systems across long periods of time. He's able to take the underlying dynamics of human behavior and predict wars, intergalactic wars, revolutions, and the whole kind of history or future of the human race. And through that, we'll come to it in a second. Okay. So through that, he's able to predict the exact year in which the planet they're on, the center of the galactic empire, Trantor, is going to be destroyed. And now, what I want to share with you is an excerpt of that book where one of his kind of junior scientists comes to him for a discussion. So Seldon asked them, what is the numerical possibility of total destruction within 5 centuries? And the student says, well, I couldn't tell, I'm not sure. And then he says, well, surely you can perform a field differentiation, whatever that might be. And the student, he doesn't have the calculator pad with him, so he's furiously calculating, the sweat sticking to his forehead. And he says, about 85%? And Seldon responds, that's not bad, but the actual figure is 92.5. So I guess this would be the state of the art in modeling of social and human capital, to be able to predict across periods exact probabilities like that. Now, unfortunately, we're not in this world, perhaps fortunately, because we don't know that we're ending in 5 centuries. But I think the point I wanted to make is that in the real world we work in, particularly as social scientists, we're quite a long way away from this. And something I've found interesting over the past few days is the perhaps greater sophistication of some of the models that Jake has presented, or in all the kind of the trial studies, that the modeling of kind of biophysical processes is a lot more sophisticated than the modeling of human and social processes. And if we think about the TEEBAgriFood framework that tries to bring together all the different dimensions of capital, I mean, the people who have conducted the preliminary studies and the people who will conduct the further studies, I think the aspects that they have struggled with the most are the human and the social side of things. And that's interesting because the agri-food system is set up to serve human needs, to nourish us, to provide what we need. So what I'm going to do is not be able to give you answers to all the questions, but perhaps to kind of point you in the right direction of some ways that we can try to model human and social impacts. And one advantage that we have as kind of social scientists trying to model these is that we can ask people. So you can't ask soil, what is the impact on soil of a monoculture production versus agroforestry versus pastoralism? But if you want to know what the impact on people is, you can ask people. So what I'm presenting here is actually work from a previous role of mine, which is where this is interviews of collated across about 1,000 local communities surrounding large agricultural investment projects about what have been the kind of the positive and negative impacts on them. And I'm going to draw out some of these throughout the presentation. And these are some of the social and human impacts that we see in the framework. So things like employment, impacts on women's empowerment, technology transfer, and an issue I think that has come up in many of the studies about access to land, from changes to the way we structure our agri-food system, that can have big impacts on people's access to land and livelihoods and culture and everything that stems from that. So as a reminder about the framework, this is the territory that we are in. So we're looking really at the human and social capital. This is the checklist, which is part of the framework. And I think where we've come to in the exercise yesterday is to identify what some of the items we could put in the boxes here are. But I think now we want to try and go a little bit deeper and work out if we identify that, for example, gender inequality is an issue, then how do we go about measuring the impact of that, of specific policy scenarios? So let me start with health. I'm not going to go through all this. Pavan mentioned in the Planet Unplugged on Monday, and it's come up that agriculture is the #1 driver of the global burden of disease. And this is some of the channels of impacts, from hunger and undernutrition to kind of obesity, diet-related diseases, environmental health, people impacted by pesticides, occupational health and safety, the farm workers, whether they have the right protective equipment. These are all the kind of impacts that come through the health channel that we need to be considering. Now, some examples of how that is measured in the literature. So these are some concepts in health economics. The value of the statistical or life year. And I think it's important to note that this is not a value on life, it's a value on the statistical life year. So it's looking at what people are willing to pay or willing to accept for small changes in their mortality risk. So it assumes that we're constantly making some kind of risk-reward trade-off on the risks that we expose ourselves to and how those impact our health. And this is modeled, for example, in air pollution, very much so in other ecosystem services. And it models kind of how much you're willing to pay for a marginal reduction in your mortality, a marginal improvement in your mortality, or how much you're willing to accept for a marginal reduction. And that can be done through, as Jake mentioned, kind of revealed or stated preference models. Quality adjusted life years, that's much more an adjustment to longevity based on the quality. So if you're living a certain age, but with a disease or a disability that has come through an impact from the agri-food system, then that would be adjusted through a quality adjusted life years. We can look at the cost of illnesses that impose both on institutions, on individuals, on society. And finally, there might be some averting behavior. What do people do to avoid potential health risks associated with agri-food systems? And I wanted to bring up this example. I don't think Priscilla is in the room, but she presented something similar from the Ethiopia study, but that study covered Ethiopia and Ghana. So this one is looking at the health-related costs of pesticide application for cocoa farmers in Ghana. So it's quite a simple metric. You kind of calculate the treatment cost based on the average treatment cost and the probability of someone being affected by these various issues, and then you come up with a figure for this is the total treatment cost for each person. So these are kind of the similar, relatively simple metrics that can be developed to assess health. Now, I wanted to spend a bit of time on women's empowerment because, as I think Barbara mentioned, that the second key pathway to sustainable food systems is female education. But I think it's something that's it's very difficult to sort of get to quantify, and I know we all understand that it's important, but how are we going to measure the impact that the policy scenarios have on this that are going to be assessed in the different countries? So I think one way to frame it is by looking at different frameworks of the constraints that women face in their participation in agri-food systems. And I just picked one, which was from a paper that I worked on, but I know there's different ways of kind of framing this, but this is just by way of example. So women face constraints with respect to their land rights, their access to productive resources, such as training, extension services, to credit. They're constrained in their access to decision-making bodies, in employment, so yes, wages, but also there's a gender division of labor. They might have worse occupational health and safety, and they bear often, in many situations, a disproportionate share of household labor. So you think about all these constraints, and you can kind of tabulate this and put this into a framework looking at the different segments of the value chain, and really start to think through at a more detailed level, rather than saying, well, yes, there will be an impact on women's empowerment. Think about what are the channels, what are the constraints that particular policy interventions are impacting, and there might be positive impacts in some areas and negative in others. So it starts to kind of build a basis of information that can inform the decisions. And a similar framework, I should say, could be done for other marginalized groups, particular communities or indigenous groups or youth. And just to, this is a study that maybe you can look up and read, but there have been some attempts by some colleagues of mine within this building in collaboration with other UN organizations to kind of quantify this gender gap in agricultural productivity. So these are metrics which pull together some of those constraints in a way. I don't have time to go through the detail, but maybe this is a study to look to when you come to your country work. Now, employment was mentioned as one of the kind of the big social impacts that we need to consider. And again, what I'm trying to do here is kind of think a bit more detail about what is employment. So if we say that certain interventions in the agri-food system are creating or resulting in a loss of jobs, I think you need to go a level deeper and think about what kind of jobs. Are these contracted jobs? Are they casual labor? Are they permanent, temporary? Is it men or women? Is it adults? Is it youth? Is it children? So it's trying to quantify some of these things that we've discussed. There's a big difference between actual employment and people who are employed, for example, through outgrower schemes and tenant farming schemes in terms of job security and the reliance that they have, the relationships that those create. The jobs might be for expatriates in a country, they might be for national employees, they might be for people from the region, or they might be genuinely local to a particular investment, where the value chain. So if you think of a production processing factory, other people employed there, are they actually local to the area? Or are they employees from the capital city, for example, where there's better levels of education? And then, yes, other related issues, sort of training, health and safety, pay and conditions that I think we need to think through. I'm conscious of the time, so I want us to have time for some group exercises, but just to again, what I want to instill is kind of, when we take one of these issues, to think through a bit more carefully the channels and how those are impacting. So food security is another big social issue, but of course there are different dimensions to food security. There's availability, there's access, there's the stability of the supply, and there's of course nutrition and utilization. And different impacts of a particular policy intervention will filter through to those different dimensions in different ways. So improving, for example, domestic production of staple crops, that might increase food availability, but if that results in displacement of people from their land, it might reduce access to food for some individuals. So those are the kind of the channels that I think we want to think through. And finally, I mean, what I've mentioned are kind of under the umbrella of social capital, but there are some attempts to kind of create these aggregate measures of social capital. You know, what do we mean? And one quote from a paper is that it's a kind of contextual phenomenon. It can't be directly observed or quantified. So what we're doing is using proxies. For example, the levels of trust within societies, between individuals, or the trust that individuals, communities have of the institutions in that country, the levels of social or civic participation. So specifically in the context of agri-food value chains, we might think about the strength of farmers' organizations, of cooperatives, savings groups, the degree of knowledge or technology transfer, and levels of trust across the value chain. So these are kind of some ways to look at social capital. It's depicted in the figure here. Again, I'm not going to go through it in detail, just to say that there's institutional measures of social capital, then there's the kind of relational dimensions, and then there's the more cognitive dimensions, which are to do with trust. But at least, you know, this isn't my expertise, but my view is that in relation to measurement of this and quantification, there's really some big questions remaining. You know, what is the loss in trust in society experienced by people who are forcibly removed from their land to make way for an agricultural production process? How do we create some measure of that we can weigh against any benefits to agricultural production? And similarly, you know, in the context of some of the Tanzanian studies, what can be how do we think about or measure the loss of social cohesion or cultural value of pastoral societies if they're restricted in their pastoral routes by plantations or equally by protected areas? I mean, for me, these are things that are discussed in qualitative terms, but I think we're some way from being able to evaluate them in a way to genuinely trade off against other forms of capital. So there are some indicators. I'm just putting these up more for reference that you can look at, but I would say that these indicators are mostly based on primary survey data. So if we really want to, in any of the case studies, go and get a serious measure of social capital, I think we need to recognize that it's going to require some primary survey work. And to that end, the OECD has a measure, a data bank of questions ways that these surveys can be designed. So I'd encourage you to refer to that if that's of interest. So sorry that was a bit quick, but I wanted to save time for the group discussion. But I wanted to come back finally to one more kind of scene from our friend Asimov and the character Harry Salmon. So there's one scene where the authorities, let's call them in this context, where they're judges, but in our context, I think they're the policy makers. And they hear about the results of his research, that the planet and the center of the galaxy will be destroyed within 500 years, and they want to understand, what's going on, and so they start interviewing him about that. And they ask him, he asserts in his trial, he asserts, I say it again, that Trantor will lie in ruins within the next 5 centuries. And the judge asked him, on what basis are you giving us that assessment? And he says, on the basis of the mathematics of psychohistory. And they rightly inquire, well, can you prove that this is valid? Can you prove that this is a valid scientific method and that your model is realistic? How do we know it's true? And he says, I can only explain it to another mathematician. And I think, to me, what this is saying is, whatever models we are using, however sophisticated, however integrated, can we explain it? Can we only explain it? If it's an economic model, can we only explain it to another economist? If it's a hydrological model, can we only explain it to another hydrologist? Because the models, whatever we're producing from these studies, it's ultimately supposed to feed policy ends. So we need to use what we're doing wisely so that it's feeding a policy purpose, and that requires us not only to understand it ourselves, but to be able to explain it in terms that will have the policy influence. So I will stop there, and then I pass to Jake maybe, or if there was some
Sure, that sounds good.
Instructions on the study.
Thank you, Will.